I attended a Christian high school when I was in high school, and no, we were not more spiritual. We were probably more heathens than those who had other education. But once a week, we would have to attend chapel services. And during my very first week of high school, my introduction to high school chapel, our youth pastor was slated to preach that morning, and he decided to use an alarm clock as a prop during his sermon. If my memory serves me correct, he was preaching on Jonah and how it was time to wake up and serve God. I think that's what he was preaching on. If not, it would have been a good illustration for that point. What he did not realize is that unbeknownst to him, while he was talking before chapel began, one of the senior students snuck up on stage and set the alarm to go off in a few minutes. So just as he was really getting into the sermon, the buzzer went off. You know how everything is just a little bit more funny in church because you know that you're not supposed to laugh at dumb things, but you just do? That's kind of how it was. When the alarm went off, that was funny. When the second alarm went off a few minutes later, it was hilarious. I don't remember how it all shook out, but I'm pretty positive that the senior class was held back for a altar call of sorts after chapel. Well, if you've been in church long enough, I'm sure that you can pinpoint some interruption that stopped the service cold for at least a few seconds. We've had the power go out before. That's challenging. That's no fun. We've had a fire alarm go off when dust had collected on one of the sensors, and it made it go off, and everybody was like, looking around, and Brother Tom said, "Sit down, you're fine." So we sat down, and we were fine. That was an interesting day. Nearly every sermon I preach, at least one phone goes off, but it's usually nothing like the time when I was preaching back in college when someone's personalized ringer started going off on their phone. "Who let the dogs out?" was the special music for that sermon that morning, and somehow it just didn't flow with Mark chapter 4 and Jesus calming the sea. But anyway, that's what it was. Well, one day Jesus was preaching to thousands of people, and he got interrupted. His sermon topic was on hypocrisy. You see, Luke chapter 11, it ended with this insight as to what was happening behind the scenes when Jesus went from one preaching place to the next. It picks up in verse 53 of Luke chapter 11. And as Jesus said these things to them, the scribes and the Pharisees, they began to assail him vehemently and to cross-examine him about many things, lying in wait for him and seeking to catch him in something he might say, that they might accuse him. They say it like 5 different times. The Pharisees were trying to lay a trap for Jesus, and he just kind of dodges and weaves the whole time, answering the correct or the right questions and just kind of skipping over the ones that aren't important. So instead of giving them the pleasure of interacting with them and answering all of their questions one by one, Jesus just goes to preaching. It started out with Jesus teaching his disciples on the pitfalls of the Pharisees, how their desire to be perceived as holy trumped their actual desire to be holy. And what started out as a small, intimate Bible study among his 12 disciples, it soon grew to what Luke calls in chapter 12, verse 1, an innumerable multitude of people who had gathered to the point where they had trampled on one another. Just read verse 1 for yourself. This crowd is all over each other trying to get to Jesus. They want to see Jesus take the Pharisees head to head. Well, I take from that Jesus was preaching hard. And it grew a large crowd. And I'm sure people were drawn to him because he had the words of life. But there's also a part of me that probably thinks that the congregation had assembled that afternoon just to hear Jesus stick it to the man. Just take these Pharisees to task. These who love to be seen by other people as spiritual giants. Get them, Jesus. Well, the sermon is powerful. It's gone past a mere tirade of Christ's frustrations with the Pharisees, and it has now gone into a plea for real life change to all who are in attendance. Essentially, the Pharisees are just a prop to this sermon. And he goes straightway in verse 8 of Luke 12, and he says, "Also, I say to you, whoever confesses me before men, him the Son of Man also will confess before the angels of God. But he who denies me before men will be denied before the angels of God." If you let me use my biblical imagination for just a second, just a little bit this morning, it seems to me like Jesus is just about to give the invitation. He is offering this gift of free life. Choose me in front of men, and I will stand up for you in front of angels and before God. He's claiming that the Holy Spirit will move in your life in some extraordinary ways if you just let him. When all of a sudden, spurred on by who knows what, an interruption worse than an alarm clock or power outage, some socially and spiritually tone-deaf man speaks up from the crowd of tens of thousands of people. Who knows where he is even? He speaks up and he yells out, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." What? What are you doing, man? Sit down, be quiet. What does that have anything to do with the hypocrisy of the Pharisees or the true confession of Christ or the work of the Spirit? It has nothing to do with it at all. It's true that it was culturally common for people to ask questions during a teacher's talk, but not like this. This unwritten law of just plain decency was enough for people to kind of look around and be like, what is this guy's problem? This is a complete departure, an irritating interruption. And you can kind of hear the annoyance in Jesus' voice as he answers rather gruffly in verse 14, "Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you?" None of this is normal. The interruption, nor the interaction. Jesus' response calling him man, it is detached and socially cold. But who can blame Jesus for responding that way? He has just poured his heart out, encouraging his followers to stay faithful and retain their faith, even if, like what will happen in a couple of years from this point, they are arrested and tried for their faith. This guy hears the word magistrate in verse 12, my assumption, that he hears magistrate in verse 12, and he thinks Jesus must be giving him a foothold to ask some legal question. So, teacher, tell my brother to split the inheritance with me. Actually, the man's not even asking Jesus a question. He doesn't even ask for Christ to intercede on his behalf with a view to justice. All he pretty much does is jump up from his seat, almost like a kindergartner, and says, "Jesus, my brother isn't being fair. Make him stop." Man, who made me a judge and arbitrator over you? And based upon this man's request, it seems as though, I think we can make the assumption, since the inheritance is at play here, his father has died suddenly, probably recently. And his father, for some reason, totally out of the cultural norm, had left no written or spoken will. So, cultural norm, tradition, would have been affected at that point. The older brother retains everything that was the father's, and now it's the older brother's responsibility to give away or keep what he wants. It's not the fairest of situations, mind you, but I get the sense that they are fresh from the funeral, and this is only the takeaway. There's hardly mourning except the fact that he didn't get everything that he wanted. So, teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. And Jesus is struck with the immaturity of it all. The impropriety of bringing this up in a public venue with his brother, obviously in attendance with him so soon after the father's death. So he says, man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you? It's not that Jesus isn't interested in justice. He is. You can see that time and time again throughout Scripture, how he treats the least of these. But settling financial affairs was so far out of the purview of why God incarnate came to earth that it just annoys Jesus. I think a man by the name of Leon Morris, he hit the nail on the head as to why Jesus seemed so frustrated with this man's question when he wrote concerning this passage. He said, Jesus came to bring men to God, not to bring property to men. Jesus came to bring men to God, not to bring property to men. So instead of sullying himself with the mundane, he said, she said, I owe, you owe of an arbitrator or a judge of his day, Jesus goes straight to the heart of the issue. Not injustice, but covetousness. Somebody's about to play Who Let the Dogs Out, it sounds like. Verse 15. And Jesus said to them, take heed and be aware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. Covetousness. Greed. That was at the heart of this man's request. It was the driving force behind his sudden interruption of the sermon. And Jesus wants to stamp it out before it even got enough oxygen to breathe and spread. And so he says, one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. New Hope, I'm going to have you say that with me, okay? You ready? 1, 2, 3. One's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. The very words of Christ. And it will be good for us to live by them. I enjoy the show American Pickers. How many of you have seen that before? I like it. I've been to their Nashville store, Antique Archaeology, and I love getting to see all the history of things from a bygone era of society, things that I have no idea what they are. You might have grown up with, but I ain't never seen them before, and they kind of bring to light and tell you what they are. Well, the premise of the show is that Mike and Frank, well, Frank used to, he's not on there anymore, they head out in their van, and they drive through the countryside of America, and they just stop, and they ask people if they have some old collectible stuff that they'd like to sell. I mean, the barns that these guys go in, the buses filled to the brim, the trailers stuffed to overflowing with old pinball machines, used car parts, old oil cans, and rolled up posters that are worth hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. I watched one episode recently where they climbed through a rat's nest of an attic in a barn for hours, I imagine. It was only a few minutes in TV time. But they pulled out, after all this searching, they pulled out an old oil can. And they offered the owner of this old oil can that had been up in an attic somewhere, they offered him $50. And the owner turned it down. He hadn't seen that thing in decades, if ever at all. And he didn't want to take $50 for it. All he said, listen to what he said. He said, nah, I just can't part with any of my stuff. I'm pretty sure at that point, Mike and Frank call like A&E and be like, hey, hoarders, you need to make it over here at this point right here. You got a great show coming down your way. Now, we might not have a collection like that. You might have a collection. I have no idea. We might not have 24 cars rusting under a tree in our backyard. But even still, we need to hear one's life does not consist in the abundance of things he possesses. You're going to die, and that stuff is going to rot. And the man who interrupted Jesus that day, he needed to hear that. Teacher, teacher, tell my brother to split the inheritance with me. One's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. Really, I think not just that one man who interrupted, but the entire multitude, the innumerable thousands that were there present that day, and us even here right now. We need to hear that today. Only Jesus can take an interruption in a sermon and somehow twist it to make the whole thrust of the sermon against covetousness like that. Without missing a beat then, Jesus starts in on one of his probably most famous parables. Verse 16, then Jesus spoke a parable to them saying, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. We'll get to that in just a second. I love how Jesus said that. Verse 17, and the rich man thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So let's talk about this parable. And let me start off by giving you a few misconceptions about this parable. We need to debunk some of these right from the get-go. You see, some people have taken this story, and I believe they have twisted it into a stuff is evil kind of parable. That sentiment is never found throughout the entirety of the Bible. It simply is not there. There are specific instances, like in the story of the rich young ruler, when Jesus counsels people to sell everything they have, but it's not because owning property, being rich, or even enjoying stuff is sinful. Jesus gives them that counsel because he saw that that person had stopped owning their stuff, and now that stuff was owning that person. It was their ever-waking and sleeping thought. Gotta protect my stuff. Gotta get more stuff. And maybe that's you here this morning. You may need, let's be honest, you may need to literally sell all and follow Jesus. Some of us in this congregation may need to do that. That was not an empty command that Jesus gave. That stuff may actually keep you from living for Christ. That's a pretty common theme throughout the Bible, but it's not always the case. So this parable is not some communistic tirade on owning personal property. His point is, don't let your stuff own you. That's the point. There really isn't a problem with expanding your business either. Some people have taken this as like a knock against capitalism. And I'm not going to preach great as capitalism or anything like that, but it's simply not in this text. Jabez in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, he pleads with the Lord that he would expand his borders so that Jabez could make God's name known better. I want Christian businesses to grow by leaps and bounds. I want that to happen so that God's name could be made famous through that business owner and that business. There's nothing wrong with expanding on the blessing that God has given you. I think the rich man in the story is probably being pretty wise in some aspect. Some might say that his tearing down smaller buildings to build bigger ones is irresponsible, excessive. But honestly, if you really look at the whole story, I think it's kind of a means for him to make sure that he can retain as much workable land as he possibly can. So he needs to maintain a pretty similar footprint so he's not taking up any more of his fertile land. The idea is, if God is blessing, make the wisest decision that you possibly can in that moment to prolong that blessing so that other people can also get in on that blessing and God's name be magnified. There's nothing wrong with owning stuff, and there's nothing wrong with expanding your business. The last misconception about this parable is that this parable isn't for me. But I want you to notice that no one is exempt from this warning. There are tens of thousands in attendance when Jesus is preaching this sermon. And don't you think that the 300 or so here at New Hope Church are exempt from all of history from this command? You're not. This parable isn't just given to the rich who own a lot. I think that's usually what we think. Well, this is just for rich people. I'm not that rich, or I'm not rich at all. So this isn't even in my realm of influence. But in fact, Jesus directs this parable to the man who, by his own admission, does not have a lot. The guy who says, Jesus, this isn't fair. Tell my brother to give me more. He's telling him, don't be covetous. Greed is not a rich person problem. Covetousness knows no class. It tempts the homeless man, the small business owner, and the stockbroker alike. The 5-year-old and the 85-year-old are all in danger of falling into its clutches. You are not exempt. But here, for this fictitious story, this parable, Jesus chooses to focus on the person who owns a lot and who has been blessed with a lot more. And even with my warnings just a second ago, I bet some of us just kind of hit mute. Well, then this is not for me. I don't own a lot, and I certainly haven't been blessed with more. I want you to assess your statement just then. I don't own a lot, and I haven't been blessed with more. And you're dead wrong. Every single one of us here this morning is living in a phenomenon that has never happened in the history of the world. You are unique throughout history, since creation till now. There has never been a people who have so much common luxury as we do. We lay our heads down on pillowed mattresses. We turn on the tap and never once worry that we will be met with water running. We flick the switch on in our living room and enjoy a brightness that most homes historically never had, even at the brightest part of the day. Most scholars believe that throughout Jesus' ministry, he probably never traveled further than 75 miles radius from Nazareth. That distance is part of some of y'all's weekly commute. You have more today than the richest of the rich, even 200 years ago. Don't even think about 2,000 years ago. The truth of the matter is that even those of us in here right now who have the least probably have more than the rich man who's depicted in Jesus' parable. So this is for you, no matter your wage, your age, or your stage. You got that? This is for you. The central problem in this entire parable are two small words that show up 11 times in 3 verses. Let me read it again to you. And he thought within himself in verse 17, saying, "What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops?" So he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." Doesn't that sound just like an elementary kid? I, my. The problem is that this man had fallen into the trap of believing that he alone was the cause of this great success. He's the one responsible. Never mind his employees who did the bulk of the job. Never mind the favorable conditions of the harvest, the right mixture of rain and sunshine, the temperate weather that season. Forget about all of that. His crop grew, and now he has no more room. But notice how Jesus prefaces the whole parable in verse 16 when he says, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. The ground. No doubt this man was out at great expense for the seed that he had bought. He had probably hired the best field workers. He had probably been faithfully working away at this land for decades prior. It is hard work, I am positive, to work a plot of land like this. But the fact remains that Jesus said the ground yielded plentifully. Jesus makes sure to underline that this is a blessing. Yes, hard won, but a blessing that was out of this man's control. And yet, he claims all the credit. The ground deals bountifully with him, and he says, soul, take your ease. His self-centeredness, it extends far beyond his credit too. Kenneth Bailey, he was a Presbyterian minister who lived 40 years in the Middle East. He remarks on how odd it would have been for this man to not seek counsel from anyone else in the village concerning what to do with this bumper crop. He writes, in the Middle East, village people make decisions about important topics, long discussions with their friends. Families, communities, and villages are tightly knit together. Everybody's business is everybody else's business. Case in point, here you have this young man who's interrupting Jesus, asking him to intercede on his behalf so that his brother will give him more stuff. Everybody knew everybody's business. And yet, in stark contrast, the man seeking help, he doesn't seek help from elders at the gate. He doesn't ask from his own foreman or friends or even a wife. What should I do with this bumper crop? No, who does he turn to? He turns to self. He thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? Scholars tell us that the most literal translation of that phrase is that he dialogued within himself. Don't do that now, or they will lock you up somewhere. He acted as though he was the only one to take credit for the bumper crop, and then he acted as though his was the only opinion that mattered. Look, I'm not against self-reflection, but can we just be honest about self-reflection? We usually give ourselves the benefit of the doubt, don't we? You're not that bad. You did put in a lot of work this week. There is great wisdom in seeking counsel from others. Otherwise, you will live as though you're the only one in existence. The problem is that if you constantly shun other people's wise counsel, eventually they'll stop giving it or even coming around. True. This man had everything and more. So much so that he can even say to his soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, drink, eat, drink, and be merry. But the truth of the matter is this, even if he had many goods laid up for many years, he has not been promised the many years with which to enjoy them. It seems obvious that he had no one with whom to share these gifts with. Whole huge barns full of food, but no one else at his table. Sure, you can eat and drink until you are stuffed, but it is really hard to be merry all by yourself. And that is the situation that he has worked himself into. He lived like he was the only one in the world until he has interrupted himself by realizing that there is another. Because God speaks up. He has sit back and he has said, "Soul, you've many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." Verse 20, but God said to him, "Fool. You fool. This night your soul will be required of you. Then, whose will those things be which you have provided?" He may have had the best meal of his life, but it was the last meal of his life. He may have laid down in the most comfortable bed, but he died in that most comfortable bed. Jesus calls him fool. God, in this parable, calls him fool. And those are heavy words. That term is thrown around on talk radio far too often today. And it was not in that day and age. In fact, Jesus had just earlier in the book of Matthew forbade anyone from calling someone else a fool, saying that if they did it, then they were in danger of hellfire. But what Jesus is saying when he calls this man fool, he says, "You are mindless, you are lacking knowledge, you fool." Listen to how God tells him he will die. He says, "This night your soul will be required of you." It's as if God is saying, "Oh, you're rich, you have no debts, you don't owe anything to anybody. Are you sure about that? And because you have squandered what I have blessed you with, your soul is payment. You do owe something to someone." Teacher, tell my brother to give me part of the inheritance. Jesus stops the parable and he looks up at the young man who's asked the question, or who has commanded of Jesus to stop this injustice. And he looks right at him and he says, "So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." There's your answer. You want Jesus to intercede on your behalf to make things more fair, and Jesus says, no, let's not even talk about the legal issue here. Let's talk about the heart issue. Where you ought to be mourning and grieving the loss of your father, the only thing you can think about is you're not getting your fair share. And it's as if Jesus turns to the crowd and, seeing their worry over chasing down stuff like this young man who had interrupted him, he imparts some of the simplest yet hard to live out commands a few verses later. He says in verse 29, "Do not seek what you should eat or what you should drink, nor have an anxious mind. For all these things the nations of the world seek after, and your Father knows that you need these things." But here's the point. Seek the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added to you. Do not fear, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell what you have, give alms, provide yourselves money bags which do not grow old, a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches nor moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. C.S. Lewis once said, "Look for Christ, and with Christ you will have all other things." But if you chase down other pathetic dreams, you might get them. You might get the big league sign up. You might get the bonus. You might get the trophy wife. You might get whatever else. But you have missed Christ. And you are bankrupt. He says, if you're going to chase down something, why don't you trade in your wallet for a money bag that will not grow old, a treasure in the heavens that does not fail. And so for just a few more minutes this morning, I want to focus on that verse 34. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Our kids in their kids' notes, that's on one side of it. I hope that they will all take that home and they'll memorize that verse. But more than that, they will live out that verse this week. Because the truth of the matter is you can flip that last verse on its head, and it's going to tell you a lot more about yourself than you really want to know. Your heart is where your treasure is. For some of you, your heart is in your self-sufficiency. You've worked for everything you've gotten in your life, and that's good. But friend, you can't earn salvation. You ought to be responsible and you ought to be the best worker on the job, but if you think you can apply that spiritually, you've got to come bankrupt before God, and then only can you get the grace that He wants to give you. But you're trusting in your self-sufficiency. You're saying, I, my. And Jesus is saying, no, Jesus, I have done it on the cross. So for some of us, our heart is in self-sufficiency. You can't earn salvation. You have to accept it. Some of you, your heart is in that bank account, that retirement fund, that boat savings. For you, it goes way past wisely planning for the future, and it goes into an all-consuming passion. Or like the crowd to whom Jesus is preaching, they are worried about where's the next dime and where's the next breadcrumb going to come from, and they are living in absolute and total fear. And Jesus says, flock, don't you know that your shepherd wants to give you the kingdom? If He wants to give you the kingdom, most assuredly, He's going to provide for you. You name it. Your heart could be in health. It could be in a job, an occupation. Whatever it is, you can be found in it, trying to find your value in something else other than the one who gave you the blessings. I've prayed all week that our time together this morning would go so far past the easy takeaway, which would be something along the lines of, I need to be more thankful for what I have. You do. We do. We all need to be more thankful. I've prayed that the sermon this morning would stir up something a lot more than, I need to give more to missions or to the church. And you do. You do. I do. We need to be more outwardly focused. Spreading the gospel ought to be paramount in our life. And if that means every dime in our checking account, give it away. But those are easy assumptions from this text. I ought to be more thankful, I ought to give more. Praise God for those. But that's not the point of the parable. Those are noble takeaways. But my heart has been kind of focusing in on that the Lord will uncover some idols that you have in your life this week. John Calvin, years ago, he once wrote that the heart is an idol factory. We are all the time contriving some new idol for us to worship. Hobby, relationship, occupation, station in life, whatever it might be, all the time, creating some new idol. We could say that the rich man worshiped his money. But can I remind you, money was never mentioned in the text. Not once. Not once. We could say that he worshiped his crop. But let's be honest, it's not like the guy erected some huge corn statue in the middle of his cornfield. He wasn't worshiping the crop. What was his real problem? What did he really worship? I, my. Say I'm not a farmer, doesn't matter. The parable is to you. Say I'm not rich, doesn't matter. The parable is still to you. I don't have a lot, doesn't matter. You've got I, you've got my. The parable is to you. And he thought within himself. He reasoned in his mind. It sounded like such a good plan. What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, he came up with the greatest answer of all time. I'll do this. I'll pull down my crops. I'll pull down my barns and build greater. And there I will store my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But if we can get real serious, real fast in the few remaining minutes, one of these days, using the phrasing of Scripture, your soul will be required of you. Can I also make the personal notation? It's going to be sooner than what you think. The bigger barns, the crops, everything that we find so much value in, it's going to be left here. And we're going to stand before God. I would hate, friend, hear me, I would hate to stand before God knowing that the free offer of salvation had been laid out on the table for 2 millennia. And I chose my. You are making one choice today. Jesus said prior to this, you cannot serve 2 masters. You can't serve God and you can't serve this world system. He said mammon, you can say money, you can say self, whatever it was. You can't serve God and serve I either. You've got to tear that idol down. I've told our Sunday evening crowd for the last few weeks that I've been really trying to read a lot more missionary biographies, listening to them as audiobooks, and the Lord's just been, encouraging me. I've told you the story numerous times. You probably know it better than I at this point. The story of Jim Elliot, of a young man whom the Lord raised up in a very literal way to reach a group of natives in South America with the gospel. And while he only had one interaction with them, it led to the saving of many. But it came at the cost of his own life, where he died as a martyr. I'm so thankful. If nobody else has been blessed with it, I have. Jim Elliot left us a journal, and it is chock full. If you don't have a copy, every Christian ought to own one. It is chock full of wisdom. And probably one of the wisest statements that he ever said was, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. If you have to sell everything to get Jesus, it's worth it. If there is an idol in your life that is detracting from the Savior, tear it down. Fool, your soul will be required of you. Who knows? It may be today.